Aha, my hearties, what type of swords did pirates actually use in the Golden Age of Piracy? Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now, this is a question inspired by a course I've been watching on Wondering, more about that in a second, but the Golden Age of Piracy is classically defined, or commonly defined, as the period of 1650 to 1730. This is the period which all of those pirate movies that you've watched are basically set in. And there are certain types of sword which were commonly used in this period, and some of them were popular amongst pirates. So for the purposes of this video, I'm only looking at piracy primarily in the Caribbean and the Atlantic, a little bit Pacific maybe, during the period 1650 to 1730. So therefore we're primarily looking at European piracy in the second half of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century. Obviously piracy goes all the way back to the dawn of time since boats were invented, and all the way to the modern day there are still pirates today. But for the purposes of this video, I expect that most of you who are watching this want to know about pirates as you classically think of a pirate. What type of swords did they actually use? And in some cases it wasn't what you'd expect, thanks to Hollywood misleading us and giving us lots of false ideas about what types of swords pirates actually use. So here we're going to do a little bit of myth busting, then we're going to do the list of the main types of swords that pirates would have used at this time, and then also we're going to have a couple of mind-opening ideas at the end, looking at a couple of or a few types of swords which could have been used by pirates in this time in the Caribbean, for example, that you might not necessarily have thought of. Now, the kind sponsors for this video are Wondrium, and Wondrium is the premier subscription service where you can watch some of the world's foremost experts on specific factual subjects. Think of it as a museum for your mind. Your brain's gonna love this place. There are absolutely thousands of hours of documentaries and courses on there to enjoy and learn from. Wondrium is particularly useful to me because there's a vast array of different historical and cultural, even religious topics on there covered, and a lot of these are very, very relevant to my work and my videos. And Wondrium's content is constantly evolving and growing, so there's new content going up there all the time. It's got standalone videos as well as documentary series, tutorials, how-tos, travelogues. Whether it's general interest or practical skills, Wondrium's the place for you. In fact, my video here today was directly inspired by a documentary series called The Real History of Pirates that I've been watching on Wondrium, and the most mind-blowing fact I've found out from it is that there was a pirate raid in 1631 on Baltimore in Ireland by Algerian pirates, which I knew nothing about whatsoever. They took a load of slaves and took them off to Algeria. In Ireland, mind blown. And even if history isn't necessarily your thing, which I doubt given that you're watching this channel, if you want to learn more things about photography or painting or music, there's stuff on Wondrium for you. And of course you can watch and listen to Wondrium absolutely anywhere on your mobile phone, your PC, your tablet, sitting in your sitting room or traveling on the train or wherever. So if you're curious about Wondrium, and why wouldn't you be, then you can try a free trial now. That's right, with this channel, with that link below, or the URL wondrium.com/Schola Gladiatoria, you can do a free trial, no strings attached. So get clicking that link or wondrium.com/Schola Gladiatoria, and I hope you really enjoy your free trial of Wondrium. And thanks once again to Wondrium for sponsoring this video and the channel. So thanks for sticking with me. Now let's get back to the topic of this video. So the first type of sword that we're going to categorize are cutlasses. They have to be, okay? Everyone knows that pirates used cutlasses, right? Did they? Didn't they? The short answer is yes, they did. However, they're not the sorts of cutlasses as most people think of them, thanks to Hollywood. The type of cutlass shown in most Hollywood movies is actually really something of the later 18th and 19th centuries. It's a naval cutlass. It's like the Royal Navy or the French Navy's cutlass used at those times by the militaries. And actually this is a later form of the weapon. But it is absolutely correct to say that during the Golden Age of Piracy, 1650 to 1730, that pirates and in fact all sailors used forms of short sword. It's just that they were earlier forms. They've got different style hilts. So primarily here we're looking at what we'd actually call hangers, cutlasses, in fairness, and dusaks. Okay, so we're looking at different styles of hilt. We've got some which have got very simple cross guards or knuckle bows, and we've got some which have got quite complex enclosed hilts with quillons and forms of basket. Some of the types of guard you'd actually find on certain longer swords as well, like the so-called Sinclair hilt, for example. So essentially, yes, it is true to say that forms of cutlass were used by pirates in the Golden Age of Piracy. However, they were earlier forms than the forms we usually see in movies, which are later naval cutlasses. So it's a subtle difference, but an important one, because they do look like different weapons. But I think it is fair to say that certainly amongst the crews of pirate ships during the Golden Age of Piracy, one of the absolute most common types of sword, unsurprisingly, would have been the cutlass. It's just that it looks a bit different to how I think most people out there, probably even most of you, think of a cutlass when I first say that word. Now, the second type of sword which would have been used, relatively common, probably more by officers than necessarily by men, I've loosely categorised for the purposes of this video as basket hilts. That is basket hilt broadswords, basket hilt backswords. Now, these were extremely popular military swords at the time. They were primarily used by cavalry and sometimes officers on foot. For that reason, they may not have been exceptionally common amongst pirate crews, because of course they have longer blades, which might make them a little bit more inconvenient on board ship. But bear in mind, we know even later that officers often carried longer swords than the men. So if most of the men are armed with forms of short sword, essentially cutlasses, dusaks, hangers, then the officers very often would have had basket-hilted broadswords and backswords. And sometimes the men would have had themselves, because remember, particularly on pirate crews, they got a share of the booty, and in some cases that would have been swords from captured ships, and in some cases they would have taken that particular sword because they liked it. There's another important element here to mention about basket-hilted swords. A lot of pirate crews were made up of people from all over the place, but we do know that a lot of pirates came from, shall we call it, the Anglo sphere, the British sphere, so colonial America and of course Britain and its colonies at that time, and people who'd run away from the Royal Navy. So they would have had a British cultural background. Now, why is that important? Well, quite simply because basket-hilted swords were very important in Britain and early colonial America as well. And they came in many forms. There are more Scottish forms, there are more English forms, there are dragoon, cavalry forms of basket hilt, but also there are things like the Sinclair hilt, Highland broadswords, but also there are things like the mortuary hilt as well. So if we go for the English Civil War and shortly after, so if we look at the beginning of the Golden Age of Piracy, 1650 to 1730, if we look at 1650 through to about 1680, mortuary hilted swords were quite popular for cavalry and cavalry officers. So these types of swords were very familiar, and not only were they familiar to those people, but they were also used in contests and training. So single stick fighting, bouting, was incredibly popular in the British world, and the cultural reference point therefore for a common type of sword would have been a basket-hilted sword. So I think they would have been relatively popular, even if they weren't as popular as cutlasses. Now, the third type of sword, which I think often gets actually overlooked but would have been relatively common, are late period rapiers, because we're talking about from 1650 onwards. Late period rapiers, what we sometimes call transitional rapiers, and small swords. So when we're looking at the Golden Age of Piracy here, 1650 to 1730, this is really the beginning of the period of the small sword, and the period in which gentlemen, certainly, the small sword was the weapon that they wore, the weapon that they carried. Naval officers wore the small sword. Army officers wore the small sword, gentlemen wore the small sword, and it has to be said that whilst pirate crews might not have been the sort of class of people you'd normally associate with wearing small swords, they had officers, and they had people from the officer class, and they had people from the sort of free gentleman class as well in some cases. So these people would have been familiar with the small sword and the rapier. And also there is cultural sort of tendencies here as well. So particularly if we look more at French and Spanish crews, then indeed we would have seen a greater prevalence of thrusting swords, the rapier and the small sword in those circles as well, even though we'd still have the cutlass probably as the most common sword. So late period rapiers, things like cup hilt, Spanish cup hilt rapiers, which really are a thing mostly of the 17th century and were really at their height of popularity at the beginning of the Golden Age of Piracy. So cup hilt rapiers, transitional rapiers, so forms of shell hilt and type of cup hilt that we find in England and the Netherlands, both countries that provided lots of people for pirate crews, incidentally, because the Netherlands and England were both great seafaring nations that had lots of naval battles at this time. So absolutely there would have been rapiers of shell hilt and cup hilt, various types around, and then early forms of small sword as well, particularly as we go into the later period of the Golden Age of Piracy, and the transitional rapiers which join these two things together. Now the fourth set of swords I put in this list I have termed half basket hilts and Walloon hilts. Okay, so these are swords which aren't full basket hilts, and they come with a variety of blades. Some of them are more thrust centric blades going towards rapiers, and some of them are more cut centric blades going towards backswords and broadswords, but there's a crossover, and some of them have quite narrow cut and thrust blades. This incidentally is also true of mortuary hilted swords as well, but in this case Walloon hilted swords, which come from the Walloons, so that we're talking about Netherlands and the Flemish speaking people, basically Netherlands and Belgium. That type of sword was popular all over Europe, so they absolutely would have found their way into pirate crews. And there are other forms of simple hilted, particularly in the early part of the Golden Age of Piracy. There are types of more simple hilted, similar amount of protection to something like a saber hilt. This is a 19th century saber, but a similar amount of protection to that, but on backsword, broadsword, and in some cases rapier blades as well. And in this category we could also lump in the so-called Bilbao broadswords, which are Spanish. It's a form of shell hilt, not quite a cup hilt, it's a form of shell hilt from the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain and Portugal, and they're usually married to broadsword blades. So this fourth category I've lumped in everything that isn't quite a full basket hilt and isn't a rapier, but it's a cut and thrust sword which has a less protection than a basket hilt and about the same level as a rapier, or sometimes even less than a rapier. But these types of swords were extremely popular in militaries and navies all over Europe and America as well, and a lot of the early American colonial swords were actually of this form. Now the fifth set of swords I've put a question mark against, and that is sabers, because I know people will ask about sabers. Now in this period, 1650 to 1730, actually sabers hadn't come into particularly widespread use in Western Europe. Obviously they were in widespread use in Central and Eastern Europe, so from the Austro-Hungarian Empire eastwards, Poland and everywhere east of there, obviously Russia and stuff. But there weren't a lot of pirates, certainly in the Caribbean, there weren't a lot of pirates coming from those areas. Most pirates in the Caribbean were coming from Western Europe, Southern Europe to an extent, and Africa, the coast of Africa, so North Africa and all the way down the west coast. So actually, would we have seen many sabers? I don't think it's impossible. Although this does join on to the sixth and final category of pirate swords from the Golden Age of Piracy. And this sixth and final group is the group that I think often gets neglected, and that is non-European. So the fact is that because of the nature of international trade and slavery and everything, colonialism, everything that was going on in this period, 1650 to 1730, you've got to remember that this is absolutely the period where certain nations, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Netherlands, and others, but they're probably the principal ones, were really starting to forge their colonies, and they were all heavily engaged in the transatlantic slave trade. So for that reason, we do get individuals and their trade goods and associated stolen, looted or purchased items finding their way into the transatlantic trade, which piracy was part of and exploited and a product of as well to some extent. So pirates of course traded in weapons across the Atlantic, but they also traded in slaves as well. So there are a whole bunch of different weapons that could have come into that. Some examples, I've actually written down some here. So some examples are the kilich, the shamshir, the yataghan, various African swords like the nimcha. So there's a whole bunch of West African and North African swords that could have found their way into pirate crews. Equally, there are Mediterranean weapons, so we look at the Ottoman Turkish Empire, the kilich, and North Africa and Ottoman, the shamshir and the yataghan. Those sorts of weapons from around the eastern and southern edges of the Mediterranean could have found their way into the slave trade as well. Moreover, there was also a degree of input from Asia as well. So we shouldn't overlook the katana, the dao, the Sri Lankan kastane, possibly the Indian talwar. So there are a whole bunch of swords from both Africa, essentially the Middle East, but also Asia as well, which could have found their way into pirate crews operating in the Caribbean, and both in the Atlantic and then on the other side in the Pacific as well. You know, I think we would have found probably a heavier Spanish and Portuguese input around there, but also Dutch as well. So to conclude, in fact, it's very easy to oversimplify the types of swords that could have been used by pirate crews in the Golden Age of Piracy, 1650 to 1730, around the Caribbean, or should we say in the Americas in general. And it is fair to say that probably the most common type of sword used by pirate crews was what we could loosely term a cutlass, even if they were forms of cutlass that don't really look like what most people today think of as cutlasses. But it's also really important not to forget all of those other types of sword, European ones, backswords, broadswords, mortuary hilts, Walloon swords, cup hilt rapiers, early small swords, transitional rapiers, all of those that could have made their way into the pirate world as well through the obvious means. And additionally, the kind of outliers, probably the least common, but nevertheless very likely to be present, sometimes forms of African, West African, North African swords, Turkish, and in some cases Asian swords as well. So in other words, if you're interested in the Golden Age of Piracy, which is frankly an absolutely fascinating, if somewhat short period of history actually, if you're interested in it, it has a almost infinite number of possibilities for swords which could be associated with it in that period from 1650 to 1730 because of the very unique nature of what was going on in the world at that time, with colonialism, international trade all over the world, very advanced shipping routes, and of course slavery as well mixed in there. So very, very interesting and complex period, and to match it, the swords are equally interesting and complex. I hope this has been enjoyable to watch, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!